Although Rachely, Rotem, and Hoang, principals of MODU, are Brooklyn-based, their relatively young interdisciplinary practice has had a particularly international focus, including installations and research in Israel, Japan, and Italy. While fellows at the American Academy at Rome, Rachely and Fu spent time visiting abandoned civic construction projects, sparking their interest in the building skeletons as an architecture that could mediate the natural environment. Their research is playing out more locally in their Second Life initiative, which envisions temporary mini-buildings within underutilized vacant buildings. In their interview for the League, Rachely and Fu described how their practice, devoted to an architecture that serves as an environmental catalyst, can influence people's ideas about climate change in the civic realm, stating that through the design of everyday experiences that can bring a new relationship to weather and the environment, we hope to change attitudes. The jury appreciated MODU's unique voice, coupled with the rigor of the firm's research, both their examination of the relationship between nature and tectonics, as well as their series of interviews conducted with a cross-generational group of architects in Japan. Within their built work, the jury found the use of time and the representation of projects intriguing, as well as the level of social interaction the projects catalyzed, all conveyed by a portfolio that they lauded as well executed and evocative.
Thank you, Anne.
Hi, it's probably obvious, but I'm Hoang.
I'm Rachely Rotem.
Thank you, Anne, for the introduction, and thank you to the League for everything that you do for us architects. It's really humbling to receive this recognition. I want to definitely thank everyone who's worked with us at MODU and many collaborators as well, of which a lot of this work would not be possible without them, who are also in the crowd. We're interested in an idea that how we practice is really about the incomplete whole. So the opportunity of the Emerging Voices Award gives us a chance to share perhaps what we have left completed and what remains to be incompleted. We've been very interested in the weather, so I'm going to start talking about the weather for the lecture. This interest of ours is really about the relationship between weather as both collective and individual, as universal and subjective. As we all know, no one really agrees on the weather. This video was taken at the same time of day, every day, for actually a month in Rome. What we see here is 16 days, so each individual video is the weather for that day. The 16 together is climate, and that's what we're really interested in, this relationship between weather and climate. We're trying to address climate change by reorienting people's perceptions about weather. So we're connecting people to each other through the environment. It's okay. Yep. Not only is this giving us an opportunity to look at the past 10 years of work, but also, especially the past two. About 2 years ago, we won the Rome Prize in Architecture, and we were very, very fortunate enough to live here for a year, working. This is the back garden of the American Academy in Rome. We called it our outdoor room because it's both interior and exterior for us, where we developed many of the ideas that we are going to show tonight, which is about this idea of architecture as an extension of the environment. And then about a year later, we received a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts to live and work in Japan. So we began our time here at the International House in its garden. This garden has been taken care of by 7 generations of Kyoto gardeners. This garden, to us, is really interesting because in this photo you see a very curated and very highly scripted design for a garden. But as you go deeper into the garden, it gets more and more wild, more natural. This relationship was interesting because for us, what we realized or learned was that there's a Japanese word called wabi-sabi, which we like because how it sounds. But also its definition, that nothing lasts, nothing is completed, and nothing is perfect. The word root of wabi-sabi is wa, which is harmony, beauty through harmony. So we really like that, this idea that it's in the imperfection that you reach harmony. So after we got kicked out of the international house, we found ourselves living in the streets. not literally, but we were living in Tokyo. And it was a bit like this. Definitely a bit of lost in translation was happening. But for us, it was perhaps more interesting because for Kelly and I, the idea of localization is that we're always from another place. And this idea is actually really important to our work, that we actually approach our work as being, designing in the contemporary world is always to be a little bit outside of it. For me, being in Japan was the first time I've lived in Asia in 40 years. So that was certainly very strange and also very familiar. And it, maybe for Rachely, being on the other side of the Mediterranean when we were living in Italy.
Well, the landscape had a lot of similarities. So we are fortunate to be from other places. We do want to find a kind of a mutual place. So we say that we're both from Asia, different places, Tel Aviv and Saigon originally. And then we travel and we have projects elsewhere. So the idea is that every time we are introduced to a new cultural context, and we're always foreign to that culture context as well. So today we're kind of show you sketches of the places and how they informed our work, and also these kind of different modes of operations in MODU. One of them is really develop a language that we can understand each other, coming from two different cultures and two different logics, and different modes of operation in different places. So in Japan, it made sense for us to meet new friends. So we created conversations with different architects. And when we were in Rome, we hopped the fence and started to visit buildings because there was nobody there to actually invite us in. So this kind of a catalog will start with the language. We talked about how it is, we heard how it is important before. So this language for us is a language of contradictions, hyperlinks between environment, social context, and architecture. And today we'll present to you these four concepts, which can be read from left to right and from right to left. So they have a Hebrew logic and an English logic, and this idea that for us it's a way of communicating our ideas among ourselves at the beginning of a project. For instance, one of these terms, soup from a button, really kind of translates how we practice an old parable about making rich flavored soup with very limited ingredients. Ideas are always being tested and developed at different economies of scale, working with two voices in parallel, reading from left to right and from right to left. It is possible to have a coexistence between dual voices and translations. Human cities and natures are always on the top of our list when we think about what we're interested in, what is important for us, and the connectivity between them. So you can connect human to cities, cities to natures, human to natures in any possible combination. And the idea, first of all, if we think about the outdoor and the civil importance of the outdoor, protest starts outdoors, not necessarily indoors, so that important. And the idea of the connectivity between those elements are a form of well-being. For us, we're trying to find this way of in-between through thinking about the weather not as one kind of dependency on mechanical engineered air or atmosphere, but this idea that you can create variations whenever is possible. And when you create this variation environmentally, you can also have also different social connectivity. Social weathers. In midwinter, sitting on stools on the sunny side of a piazza in Rome, this is where strangers meet, sharing a moment of thermal contradiction. It is both indoors and outdoors, personal and collective, a momentary pause between public and private expectations. So we are in Rome, 2 stories below the public ground, in an archive of Piranesi's engravings. So this is where all of his engravings are stored. And we're looking at the plan of Del Campo Marzio, which is a plan of both real existing Roman ruins as well as imaginary city that was completed by Piranesi. So it's both real and fantasy. And when we look at that fantasy city, it is a city with no doors. So it's kind of difficult to see the borders between the inside and the outside. And you can start to imagine how air starts to move freely from one place to another. And what's also interesting about the houses at that time, the domus, is that there was indeterminacy in terms of programs. If it was in the winter, in a very cold day, you could actually sleep in the kitchen, which was the warmest room. And in the summertime, you can sleep on the rooftop to get the Mediterranean breeze. Piranesi, which was obsessed, of course, in documenting the ruins. But what was interesting for us in his drawings is that he actually, through time, changed them. And this forbidden picture that we took unknowingly or knowingly is basically Piranesi through the years coming back to his engraving and changing them. And you can see how the lines become harder and harder. And he literally changed the skies and social context. He never changed the architecture. At the time, ends of 1800, it was the end of the Ice Age, the small Ice Age, which means, or is it a question if Piranesi actually drew climate change? So our first project we're going to show you today is cloud seeding in Tel Aviv. It was designed as for an abandoned plaza in front of a Ron Design Museum. If you've been in that part of the world, it is, when you don't have any shade, it's very hard and brutally reflective, hard sun. So our first proposal that we thought of is literally to create a space, a public space that provides you shade that doesn't necessarily just move with the sun, but shade that actually can respond to the wind. We deployed 30,000 balls in different sizes to create this kind of horizon landscape. And the idea is that this is one scenario out of many possibilities of how those balls will react with the breeze. Very simple structure, greenhouses, both locally used and globally. And we deployed a very thin mesh that allows rain to come through it, but allowed the breeze to come through in different angles and allow the balls to move freely from one side to another. Of course, the biggest challenge here to make sure that it's absolutely aligned and that the balls don't stagger from in one specific location. So purposefully so, the architecture is not complete. We left space for the balls to move, and in that sense, we don't design for completion. The weather and people basically create that space. And again, indeterminacy in terms of program, we didn't want to force what people would do there, but it became a space where slowly it was inhabited in different ways, and the museum also used it in different times of days. People started to use to use the square again, making it part of their kind of path through the day. And the idea of kids playing with a ball is literally all you need is a football to play underneath, and it becomes complete. Indoor city in Rome. It's both in a scale of installation and a city, imaginary city, a radical city. City that allows for extreme scenario of private and public to collide, and different microclimate and social climates that occur. It was made by 40 feet long piece of paper, one sheet of paper, and it was made to be destroyed by the weather through time. The city was comprised again from this hybrid of architecture and climatic elements. So, for instance, air corridor that allow air to flush the city, walls of air that are invisible curtains of walls, roof ponds that collect water for the city. It is extreme scenario of indoor and outdoor, not so extreme when you think about the internet and how we use it, but more extreme in the physical world. And the different scales merge. Is this a scale of a corridor in a house, or an avenue in a city, a room, or a piazza? The idea of again, indeterminacy in terms of program. You can choose which bed to use, where to dine, where to bath, all related in how you feel comfortable in a place and how warm or cold it is. This project was a collaboration with climate scientist, composer, two writers, and historian. We made it work. One of the things we've done with the climate engineer is that he had calculated how much pollution will a new city create. And this was brought back to the model through this black ice that actually had carbon, and those ice balls basically destroy the model through time. I'm going to create, kind of let you, expose you for a little sketch of that experience. We're going to hear the two writers writing, kind of reading scenes of connecting city and the environment, and the composer breaking their words and creating environmental sounds.
Snow was coming down hard, erasing the city. On the west end, just outside the Apelles, the wind was whipping a no parking sign like a fighter getting worked. The snow did not twinkle or float. It crashed down. The snow was coming down. The storm rested harm to the earth. On the west end, just outside the Apelles, the wind was whipping a no parking sign. It had silenced the mechanical throng of the city, the grating metal, and the snow was coming and the incessant.
Since Muslims being concentrated and expensive and merchants, coming in the interior side of the wall, the five frame, the sights, the sounds, the smells, the cool breeze, she has calls to prayer, his still features, marking his own familiar time, regeneration, in short, the senses being cleansed.
Long ago, it happened in one place. It could flatten cane breaks, there was nowhere to hide. Later, the men burned the canes and painted there, and the land was not the same. The sky had a greenish cast and a muted circular tumbling. The animals lifted their hands.
Second nature. Moving from the bedroom to the kitchen, he goes outside next to the street, an architecture that has both forms of second nature, social codes and environmental boundaries. Architecture and nature as extensions of each other rather than as oppositions. This is a project that we did in Beijing. in the former Olympic park. And for us, a project like this, something like Outdoor Room would be connected to Indoor City through climate. We're specifically looking at the issue of air pollution in Beijing, that on one day you can wake up, look outside your hotel and see the building across the street, and then you wake up the next day and it's gone, right? And the idea of this city that appears and disappears was one of scale for us. So the concept was about a city in the room in the city. What we're creating is really a small room in a vast urban space. And how do you behave differently when you're in an interior that's also urban? So really, this is a sky window that we were creating, and the sky window would frame views of the Olympic landmarks that would appear and disappear as air pollution filled its gaps. When you do projects about weather, what inevitably happens is when you get it photographed, you get the weather you'd never expect. It took us 2 weeks to get this photograph because Beijing had unbelievably clear skies for those 2 weeks, but we finally got it. So really, it's a kind of barometer to raise awareness of the issues of air pollution and how one experiences it, as opposed to the data of it. We chose a fabric that was both translucent and reflective, so it kind of absorbed and reflected the skies of the color. So here we're talking about architecture as an environment that are extensions of each other. Much of our work in the installations, which we see as built forms of research, is about weather adaptable enclosures. It's usually the enclosure that is something that is changing with time and changing with the environment. We've been doing research also for the past few years on the idea of weather adaptable structures. We've been working with structural engineers and with workshops that we teach at the University of Technology, Sydney. We make sure to go there during New York's winter and Sydney's summer. What we're trying to do is look at how traditional structural systems are about resisting. It's all about making something strong enough. But what if you use a material like carbon fiber to actually flex with as a structural element? The carbon fiber has new opportunities. It's actually made of carbon atoms that are compressed together and bonded. And so it has 10 times the strength of steel, and it's 5 times lighter. So it's both stronger and lighter than steel, so more flexible. And this idea of a flexible structure is one in which we create these structures that can flex. And there's opportunities, we think, in things like anti-seismic technology, basically seismic devices that would move subtly as the ground sways. Moving to Japan. When we were in Japan, we came across a project, literally, kind of coming into the project. And we ended up interviewing seven Japanese architects across 5 generations. This is 50 years of Japanese architecture culture, from Generation 1, Fumihiko Maki, one of the post-war metabolists, to Generation 5, practices that emerged out of the post-2011 earthquake and tsunami. We would ask the architects a very similar set of questions, all 7 of them. And the questions generally had to do with things that we really admired in their work. The relationship between the inside and the outside, between the scale of the very small and the vast urban, or questions about how do you define completion or incompletion in architecture. What was interesting when we asked this question about the boundary between inside and outside to Maki and Nishizawa was that they had very similar answers. They were talking about engaging the space between buildings and activating that space. And really what we realized was a project like Hillside Terrace, which began 30 years, it was a 30-year project, but was 40 years before Moriyama House by Nishizawa, really was exploring very similar issues. So through these conversations, we would learn more about their work and also be able to kind of absorb more of this, make the experience of working in Japan a more instrumental one for us. Hillside Terrace was a project built over 30 years, 1 client, 6 projects. In a way, it remained incomplete for 3 decades. The strategy was to break up buildings into smaller buildings and designing for the space in between them. Maki would talk about these as linkages when he was writing in the early 60s. And these are linkages that are designed for both humans and nature. They get programmed differently during weekdays and weekends. And he had this very simple idea, which was that he was designing to provide space for a tree in its shade. So the very similar ideas, I think, what is at play in the Moriyama house by Nishizawa. When it's a house in which you move from bedroom to kitchen, you move outside. You have to go outside each time. And this is where, in a way, they're mobilizing the relationship between the interior and the urban, and the gap between buildings as a form of circulation. Before we went there, we were really thought that it was, we've been following this project, and we thought we were really amazed by it. And what we really appreciated when we got there was that it's actually really fits in with the neighborhood. You're looking on the right at the block plan. This is the neighborhood that it's in. It's really just one scale down, right? And that the Japanese house is already a kind of atomized version of the houses that we're used to. It is a kind of seamless flow between the street and the house and between the urban and interior, so much so that they had to put up the sign on the left to keep people from walking literally inside the house. This idea of a kind of continuity between interior and exterior was evident when we found this scroll, which we really love. It's a really important debate. It's a debate about what to do with the rice. Do you use it to eat, or do you use it to make sake? Sake.
After the lecture.
No. So it's like a continuous film, this drawing. It shows different scenes, but what's interesting is that not only is there movement between inside and outside and back inside, but there's actually 5 different axonometric viewpoints. So it's almost as if the drawing itself in the 17th century was moving people through the space. And even on the right, what you see is an interior space that the clouds actually enter into, which we liked, this idea. Invisible gaps. In the summer heat of Tokyo, the voids in between buildings offer momentary coolness. Gaps are opportunities for occasional architecture. They are either lit light or in shadow throughout the day. They grow bigger in the city, and they become places for temporary humans. This is a project that is an initiative that we've launched, and we're working with Transolar here in New York and with Scott Hughes from Silman. We're looking at gaps in the US post-industrial city condition, and their gaps exist at all scales, but this is a drawing of gaps that is at the scale of building. They are vacant buildings, and they're common to many post-industrial cities. These are properties that escape the market demand for, could be renovation or for adaptive reuse. St. Louis has over 8,000 vacant buildings. This does not include vacant lots, because we're mostly focused on the buildings. Each one is a void in the city that lowers nearby properties values, distresses their neighborhoods, create unsafe spaces, and drains municipal tax rolls. In Philadelphia, it's one of the few cities in which it's actually becoming more green. It's not necessarily from anything that the city is trying to do, but actually it's becoming more green because of the vacant building, the overgrown lots and the vacant and the vegetation's happening within the buildings. There's 40,000 vacant buildings in a city of 1.5 million people. So we've launched this Second Life initiative. It's about mobilizing design to reimagine what we can do with abandoned and vacant buildings. We have a strategy called mini buildings within buildings. These are lightweight modular structures that are a seed to use the larger building. I should probably say that we also worked on this, designed a good chunk of it while we were living in Japan. So there's definitely a lot of influence, I think. So the line is a mini building that would be a hub for activities to grow from during the spring, summer, and fall, taking over area in the vacant building. During the winter, like putting on your coat, the activities get shrunken and centralized within the line itself, which is heated through passive solar hot water systems. We don't have an idea necessarily at this point what it's used for. The idea is that we would be working through community workshops to determine what they need, or what perhaps even whether it's a neighborhood or an owner needs. But what we do know is it's much more feasible to build and provide 15% of a building, and to provide electricity to that and heat during the winter than to these very large buildings that so far has escaped that possibility. We're currently developing the line for a site for an abandoned warehouse in the city. There's a second prototype. So the idea with Second Life is that we designed a couple of prototypes so that they can be used for different conditions. The second one is called the MAT. It's for a smaller building, and it provides a means for vacant properties to be used, but also to be structurally stabilized. A lot of the issues with these buildings is their bearing walls have, they risk falling in because they've lost their roof and they've lost their floors. Basically, they've lost their lateral stability. So the idea is to design a system that can be built by unskilled labor, so basically volunteers. It's an open floor framing system, and it would provide the lateral stability. And within that, we insert these mini rooms. They are in blue. These are the things that would be, in the winter, these are the only areas that would get heated. So basically, again, this kind of 25% of the building. And in the spring and fall and summer, that you would be able to use the whole building. So the idea is that this can work for a much lower cost and also avoid the cost of the city, which in some places it costs tens of thousands, if not more, dollars to take down a building. The idea is that it's a kind of bridge. The Second Life is a bridge to other forms of occupancy, 3 to 5 year span in which something can be used, can contribute to the neighborhood, the community can enjoy it, and then hopefully it gets purchased for other development, and then we pull up the elements that are more temporary and build them in another site. We're working with urban planner Naomi Hersen-Ringskog in Newburgh. And Newburgh is a very unique condition, which is that it has the second largest concentration of historical buildings in New York State, second only to Brooklyn Heights, but it has almost 800 vacant buildings. This is for a population of 23,000 people. So this is in early phases, but the idea is like, what can we do for structures like this? It's first a kind of community outreach process, and then working with our collaborators, developing a mini building for this project. So what we are doing is we're not designing for the 1%, but for the 3%. Unlike European cities made of walls, Tokyo is a city made of gaps. It's a city of independent buildings that are constantly changing. In Japanese, the word ma is gap, a pause, or an in-between space. It's a way to subdivide the city. In Tokyo, a city like Tokyo, the city is subdivided from a series of laws, one of which is that you can only build one building on a site. The other is that you need half a meter setback from all 4 sides. So what you have are no party wall conditions. You have a series of very independent buildings. Some would say it's actually perhaps the most democratic way to build. The third condition is that it has very strict inheritance laws. So over time, for the past 50 years, as an owner wants to pass on their property to their children, in order to do it and escape certain penalties, they subdivide the lots. So on the left, you see an area of Tokyo from 1940 to 2005. Right? So it's this kind of further and further atomization of the city, which has actually created more and more gaps. So when we were in Tokyo, it was summertime, and it was extremely hot. So we found that these gaps were really cool. We would be seen sticking our heads in the gap to see what temperature they were. And we were always disappointed if they put their mechanical systems in the gap, which they're not supposed to, but which made the gaps too hot. It's interesting to think that the city is a city in which, as the land value is always higher than the value of the home, the average life of a building in Tokyo is 26 years. It's a city also that has, because the properties get smaller and smaller, the lot of land is now 750 square feet. It's a city of 1.8 million homeowners. In a project like this, Katsuo Sajima's Hokusai Museum, the gaps in the facade create naturally ventilated outdoor atrium. There's one building that has one building made up of 4 small buildings at the ground floor and then reconnecting at the upper floor. And we would document a lot of these conditions using the thermal cameras. This interest in gaps is at all scales. So this is the myth of Namatsu, who is a giant catfish that live beneath the mud in Japan. And it's actually the movement of this catfish that causes earthquakes. And it's from this we learned that in Japanese traditional wood construction, there are very, very small gaps, joints, and basically all of the wood joinery is designed to move during earthquakes, which we thought was remarkable. In this Japanese house, we're looking at the engawa, which is the kind of outer porch of the home. And we're reminded of the term ma, the gap. And here, the gap is actually the wall. Japanese architecture are buildings without walls, perhaps in a way like Rachely was describing, related to Piranesi's vision of Rome as a city without doors. These inside-outside boundaries are made with roof and floor only. But as with the other drawing that we showed, what was interesting was that this is also a drawing constructed of 5 or 6 viewpoints, as if the gap is always meant to be moved through. The threshold between inside and outside is something that you experience in movement.
Architecture itself is never complete, as it is embodied in many potential scenarios and outcomes. Perhaps architecture can never be completed, but can be made whole in connecting people to each other through the environment. If it rings a bell, this is a sort of a map of Italy. And it shows 600 towns or cities with incomplete construction sites of public work from the past 30 years. This is what brought us initially to Rome. And at the beginning, we used our left-to-right logic to try to get permission to access these spaces. And then the right-to-left logic basically allowed us to hop the fence and start documenting these beautiful constructions. They have no memory inside. No one has ever lived there, so there's no personal memory. No one ever grew up there, and there's no collective memories. And what's interesting about these places is right now are considered embarrassment by local architects, that for us there are opportunities. I forgot to mention that there's actually a minister of the incomplete in Italy, and I'm not sure what is an incentive to ever finish or complete this project. I wish him good luck. But in a very hot summer day, if we would find it, and we try to visualize it through the thermal camera, how pleasant it is to be in those concrete kind of enclaves. So platform actually is what originated all of our research. We are now in Aldo Rossi
Building.
Auditorium, and this is a project by Aldo Rossi. Maybe it is one of his biggest achievements in that sense that it is a true ruin. So it is in the outskirts of Milan, a true ruin by Aldo Rossi, who always was fascinated by the collective memory of a ruin. So the train does pass very close, but doesn't stop in the station. Again, outskirts of Milan, where work is very much needed. And the idea is that you can create a space for a community to go there and perhaps do something like the American Academy in Rome does, where people sit together and they learn, work, and also teach each other and lecture and kind of share knowledge. But when we look at this building, the idea is, how do you design for a building that is incomplete to continue to be incompleted? We didn't want to finish it. So the idea is, for instance, instead of a rail, to create some sort of a mesh, of course, to protect you not to fall, but allow for the continuation of growth of nature and allowing nature to come into the building and be part of the process of it being as wonderful as it is open. And these are in a kind of thermal visualization of the ground floor in the winter time, how much sun is able to access and be stored in the concrete slab. So the idea is, okay, maybe these buildings are not occupiable for 12 months a year, but if we think about a temporary use, maybe we can use them 9 or 10 months of the year. So the idea is to create thermal variation and social variation to allow for people to come in and choose every day where they want to work and who do they want to, and what kind of social relationship do they want to have. We created these different prototypes. We call them the mini buildings, and that's the beginning of that process. But the idea is the moment you insert something smaller than the building itself, then the building does not become a building anymore, and we look at it as, in a way, a plaza. So the space in between the outside and this mini building has a new life and a new meaning beyond an incomplete or a failure. Those colored roofs are basically radiant surfaces that their angle allow for the heat to actually pollute to the outwards and gravitate people towards different warmth or cool environments. So different spaces, multi-stage area where there's more public gathering of more people and water can be collected on this roof above. And mini towers where how do you basically heat an open air space? You can actually and literally heat the furniture itself. And this kind of proposal is something that we worked a lot with Solar in Germany. The last project of today, because I know you're probably very hungry, or at least we talk about rice and sake before. So a project for a dear client who actually passed away, Dougal. And this is a project in Connecticut. The scale is correct. We didn't Photoshop the people too small. The building is in the size of the Tate Museum in London. And the first question is, how do you heat this or cool this place? And basically the answer that you don't. And what's really great was about Dougal is that he had a lot of vision and a lot of kind of progressive vision. He wanted it to be a manufacturing area, but also a place for events and education and so on. This is part of this drawing language. We started with Piranesi drawing. I'm not comparing us to Piranesi, but this is a way for us to visualize different climatic or the invisible forces within the building. How do you can divide this mega space into thermal different zones so you can conserve energy? The white box inside is actually a space that needs to be completely dust-free. So these kind of onions of spaces around it that has less and less dust particles. But how do you allow for connectivity between people who works in different zones of the building while maintaining different climates inside? So the idea was to use air curtains, industrial air curtains that allow to keep thermal differences while visual connection between people. And what's more interesting is that if you tweak them a little bit or hack those curtain walls, you can actually have two separate sound zones. So one sound zone cannot hear the other. So this is how the visualization of the weather looks, the indoor weather. It was affected by Sandy as well. So the idea is how do you create remediation strategies for it not to be flooded again. I'm thinking of about a 3 feet thick concrete that was strategically cut to allow for this mini island to get all the water, to retain all the water to it and help to remediate the water in the area and also create a kind of a green space for the people who work there. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks.